The opinions and assertions expressed herein are those of the instructor and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Naval War College or the Department of Defense. This series of lectures contains images which may disturb some viewers, including documentary wartime footage.
On April 1st, 1945, United States forces invaded the Japanese island of Okinawa on the very doorstep of the Japanese home islands. For months, U.S. Navy leaders had argued that the island of Formosa off the Chinese mainland was a better target. The U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, a forceful and assertive individual, insisted that capturing the island of Formosa would allow the United States to develop closer logistic ties to the nationalist Chinese who were fighting the Japanese on the Asian mainland. Indeed, King had wanted the U.S. to invade Formosa instead of going to the Philippines months earlier. But he'd lost that argument to General Douglas MacArthur, another forceful and assertive personality, who had made the recapture of the Philippines a personal crusade. And after that, U.S. Army leaders continued to oppose an invasion of Formosa, preferring to attack the smaller island of Okinawa, which, being closer to Japan, made it a more likely staging base for an eventual invasion of the Japanese homeland. Since the strategic objective was to cut Japan's supply line from the resource-rich islands of the South Pacific, the conquest of either island would meet the goal. King finally conceded the argument after Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the fleet that would have to execute the invasion, noted that the logistics needed for an attack on Formosa could outstrip the Navy's capacity. To conduct the invasion of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, the United States in September 1944 organized a new army, the 10th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. Buckner's full name was redolent with history. His namesake, Simon Bolivar, had been the 19th century liberator of a half-dozen Latin American countries. But Buckner's name had another historical connection. His father, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Sr., had been a Confederate general during the Civil War. That senior Buckner had the dubious distinction of being the first rebel general to surrender an army to Northern forces, to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in 1862. He also became very nearly the last Confederate general to do so 3 years later in June 1865, 2 months after Appomattox, when he surrendered to Union authorities in Texas. You might ask how a Civil War officer could father a son who fought in World War II some 80 years later. The answer is that 20 years after the Civil War was over, the 62-year-old Buckner Sr. married a 28-year-old woman who bore him a son whom they named Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. So that now, 59 years later, Buckner, Jr. commanded a far larger army than any his father ever had. Indeed, it was the largest American ground force in the Pacific Theater outside of the Philippines, where Douglas MacArthur commanded more than 1 million. Curiously, MacArthur's father, too, had been a Civil War general, though he had fought on the Union side. Another interesting and potentially significant aspect of Buckner's 10th Army was that it was a mix of both Marine and Army divisions. It consisted of 4 Army divisions plus 3 divisions of Marines. And that's noteworthy because in many of the World War II campaigns across the Pacific up to this point, Army and Navy leaders had clashed, sometimes heatedly. Some of this conflict was just inter-service rivalry. But a central issue, and the one that generated the most animosity, was the speed of ground operations. The Marines insisted that it was better to conduct rapid assaults, even if that meant taking heavy casualties. The aim was to shorten the battle and achieve what strategists call a QDV, a quick, decisive victory. The Army argued that it was better and wiser to adopt a more deliberate approach, one that preserved American lives, even if that meant prolonging the campaign for several days. The Marines acknowledged that such a protocol might save lives in the short run, but they insisted that it could prolong the war and therefore result in greater casualties in the end. This doctrinal difference led to sharp words and a few open disputes. The most notorious confrontation was the so-called Smith versus Smith controversy that had boiled over during the American assault on Saipan in the summer of 1944. The overall ground commander in that campaign had been Marine Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, an abrasive and confrontational officer whose nickname was Howling Mad. During earlier operations, he had twice already feuded with the commander of the Army's 27th Division, Major General Ralph Smith. Now, on Saipan, Ralph Smith's 27th Division held the center of the American line, with Marine units advancing on both flanks. The terrain in the center was difficult, and whether it was because of that or due to the Army's battle doctrine, the 27th Division advanced markedly slower than did the Marines on either flank, who had to hold up and wait. Waiting infuriated Holland Smith. After the 27th was repelled 3 times from a Japanese strongpoint that the Americans had named Purple Heart Ridge, it was the last straw. Holland Smith scribbled a note relieving Ralph Smith of his command. In short, a Marine 3-star general fired an Army 2-star general in the middle of a battle. It was, in a word, shocking. Afterward, the two services, unsurprisingly, took sides. The Marines defended Holland Smith, citing operational pressures, while the Army rallied around Ralph Smith. And then General Robert Richardson, the senior Army commander in the Pacific, poured gasoline on the fire. When once the battle was over, he traveled to Saipan to present medals for heroism to members of the 27th Division, doing so without consulting or even notifying Holland Smith. It was more than a breach of protocol. It was a deliberate slap in the face. That made many wonder if an invasion force for Okinawa that was composed of both Marines and soldiers could function efficiently, or at all. Okinawa was, and is, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands that extend southward for nearly 1,000 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's home islands. It is a narrow island, more than 60 miles long from north to south, but only 2 to 18 miles wide. And it is surrounded by a number of outlying islands, almost like escorts gathered around a carrier. Quite apart from Okinawa's military attributes, the island held emotional and psychological importance for the Japanese. Okinawans are not ethnically Japanese, and they speak their own dialect. But in 1879, Japan had officially integrated the island into the empire. So by 1945, it was considered part of the homeland. When American soldiers landed there, it would be the first time an enemy boot had trod upon the soil of Imperial Japan. The American assault began on April 1st, 1945, which was Easter Sunday. After a massive air and sea bombardment, Marines went ashore on the island's southwest coast. To their astonishment, the landings were all but unopposed. The Japanese had withdrawn inland to a fortified area of caves and tunnels, as they had earlier on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and elsewhere. To confront Buckner's 100,000 invaders, a number which eventually grew to over 250,000, The Japanese had about 75,000 combat soldiers of what was called the 32nd Army, plus another 20,000 or so in differently trained militia forces. The Japanese commander was 57-year-old Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, a quiet and competent officer who ordered his men to avoid costly counterattacks and remain in their underground fortifications, compelling the Americans to come and get them. This strategy was designed not so much to defend the island or to hurl the invaders into the sea, it was to maximize the number of American casualties. Even now, with their homeland on the brink of starvation and destruction, the Japanese clung to the hope that the Americans might tire of their losses and seek an agreement. That scenario was never very likely, and it was much less so now that the Americans had attained overwhelming superiority at sea and in the air. Indeed, the American fleet committed to the Okinawa invasion was nothing short of awesome. I know that awesome is a word much overused these days, but it fits. Here's a useful comparison. The Allied invasion of occupied France in June 1944, D-Day, had deployed 7 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 132 destroyers. Pretty impressive. At Okinawa, the invading force was supported by 18 battleships, 27 cruisers, and 177 destroyers, including destroyer escorts. More significantly, the Americans also employed a total of 39 aircraft carriers, 11 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, and 22 escort carriers. Here's another comparison. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, the Americans committed 3 carriers, all they had at the time. Now, just 3 years later, they employed 39 of them in a single operation. The invasion fleet itself consisted of scores of attack transports, cargo ships, landing ships, and their escorts, all under the command of Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had led the American amphibious landing force since the invasion of Guadalcanal back in the summer of 1942. In short, the American armada at Okinawa was overwhelming. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, once masters of the Western Pacific, had all but disappeared. Only 3 of its capital ships remained afloat, and 2 of them were of little practical use. They were the former battleships Issei and Hyuga. The Japanese had tried to convert them into aircraft carriers by building short flight decks astern. Planes could take off from these platforms, but they could not land there, even if the Japanese had enough planes and pilots to do so, which they didn't. In any case, both ships were so badly damaged as to be unseaworthy. That left only the oversized battleship Yamato, which in 1945 was still the largest warship in the world. Japanese admirals disagreed about how the Yamato might be used in the Okinawa campaign. Most argued that she should be held back to contest the likely American invasion of the Japanese homeland. Others argued that it was shameful for this powerful weapon to languish in port while Japanese soldiers died defending Okinawa. The Japanese did have one wild card. The greatest danger to the American invaders, especially to the ships afloat, came from Japan's young suicide pilots, the kamikaze. The Japanese recalled planes from all over what was left of their empire, even from China and Manchuria, in order to hurl them sacrificially at the American fleet off Okinawa. A total of nearly 1,500 suicide pilots would fly their desperate one-way missions against American ships. And before the campaign was over, they would sink 36 ships and damage over 300 more. But they could not stop the invasion. Ashore, the ground campaign for Okinawa was as fierce as earlier campaigns had been on Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. The early going was deceptively easy for the Americans. The landing on the beaches was routine, or as routine as inherently dangerous amphibious operations can be. Elements of Buckner's 10th Army swept across the narrow width of the island without encountering heavy opposition. They captured 2 important air bases on the first day, and within a week, advance elements had reached the island's northern tip. The Japanese, however, were burrowed deep into caves and tunnels at a strong point in the southern part of the island. General Ushijima made his headquarters in a rocky area dominated by an ancient fortification known as Shuri Castle. Amid its steep slopes and narrow ravines, he designed and built underground defenses with interlocking fields of fire. The caves and tunnels were stocked with provisions, and Ushijima ordered his men to hold out as long as possible, denying the Americans control of the island and giving the kamikazes the time they needed to destroy the invasion fleet. As the campaign dragged on, Japanese admirals in the home islands felt a growing sense of shame. Kamikaze pilots and Japanese soldiers were dying by the hundreds and thousands, and yet the once mighty Imperial Navy did nothing. Perhaps honor required committing their last remaining capital ship, the Yamato, to this battle after all. The champions of this view received a powerful, indeed an irresistible boost from Japanese Emperor Hirohito himself when he asked, "Where is the Navy?" It may have been simply a question, but to Japanese naval officers, it was humiliating. To them, it was intolerable that anyone, especially the emperor, should think that the Navy had lost its warrior's soul. In the end, the chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Ryunosake Kusaka, decided that the Yamato must sortie because the Imperial Navy's honor was at stake. The problem was that at 73,000 tons, the Yamato consumed an astonishing amount of fuel, and there was not enough fuel oil in all of Japan to allow her to fight a conventional naval battle. American submarines had cut off the supply lines of oil from South Asia, and American bombers had wrecked the refineries. The Japanese had resorted to synthesizing fuel from rice and vegetables, even though much of Japan's civilian population was starving. And even with that desperate expedient, there was only enough fuel for the Yamato to make a one-way trip to Okinawa. As a result, the plan that emerged was for the Yamato and a handful of escort ships to steam south from mainland Japan and expend all of their ammunition against the American warships. Then the Yamato was to beach herself on the island so that her crew could join the fight ashore. The plan was utterly absurd. First, without air cover, there was virtually no chance the Yamato could make it to Okinawa at all. And even if she did, her crew could hardly climb out over the side into deep water and swim ashore to fight the Americans. It was, in fact, a suicide mission, exactly like those of the kamikaze pilots. One of the ship's officers told the crew, "We are being given an appropriate chance to die." On April 7th, 1 week after the Americans first landed on Okinawa, the Yamato sortied along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. An American submarine spotted them almost immediately and reported it to the High Command. The American commander of the carrier force off Okinawa, Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher, flashed a short message to Raymond Spruance, the overall American fleet commander. "Will you take them or shall I?" Spruance replied, "You take them." Anticipating that response, Mitscher had already given the order to launch 280 planes toward the Yamato's reported coordinates. She never had a chance. The Yamato and her escorts put up an impressive amount of anti-air fire, but it was useless. Within minutes, her accompanying cruiser was hit by 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes, and most of the destroyers were hit as well. The cruiser and 4 of the destroyers sank. But the real focus of the American attention was the Yamato herself. The American bombers and torpedo planes attacked the big battleship in waves. Hit by dozens of torpedoes and scores of bombs, the Yamato slowed, stopped, and took on a severe list. Then, suddenly, shockingly, she exploded in a spectacular fireball. An American bomb had apparently penetrated to her magazine. The mushroom-shaped cloud signifying her destruction reached thousands of feet into the sky and was visible for hundreds of miles. When the smoke cleared, the Yamato was gone. Nearly 3,000 men went with her. During the entire attack, the Americans lost only 10 airplanes. The Yamato's dramatic destruction was a kind of metaphor for the demise of the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy. It was symbolic in other ways too. The Japanese, when they'd begun their rampage of conquests in the winter of 1941-42, had often presented themselves as liberators of South Asia. They had come to expel the European imperialists, they said, so that Asia could be ruled by Asians. Initially, such appeals gained support, though native peoples soon appreciated the emptiness of such claims. That's because the Japanese proved at least as tyrannical and exploitive as the Europeans had been, if not more so. Now, with Japanese weakness exposed, the Westerners were eager to reassert their claims. And they could do so because the war in Europe was drawing to a close. Hitler killed himself on April 30, 1945, while the Battle of Okinawa raged, and Germany formally surrendered on May 7th. Even before that, the Allied victors, and the British in particular, sought to reclaim their former roles in Asia. Prime Minister Winston S. Churchill offered to send ships of the Royal Navy to the Pacific to help the Americans finish the job against Japan, and not incidentally to help reestablish Britain's Asian empire. Churchill no doubt felt a genuine obligation to the Americans for their support during the war, including both Lend-Lease aid during those dark days in 1941 when England fought alone, as well as their side-by-side victories in Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He genuinely sought to repay at least some of that by helping to bring about the final defeat of the Japanese. But in addition to that, Churchill had always been a proud imperialist. He'd remarked in Parliament that he had not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. So getting the Royal Navy back into the Pacific not only paid a debt to the Americans, it also contributed to the reestablishment of British sovereignty over its former Asian colonies in Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and elsewhere. Of course, the Americans had little sympathy with those ambitions, and the U.S. Navy did not particularly want British help. Ernest King, the American Chief of Naval Operations, said that British warships were not needed and not wanted. They were more likely to be a burden than an asset. Furthermore, King resented the idea that while Americans had fought their way across the Pacific for 4 years, the British now wanted to jump in to claim a share of the victory. Of course, there were political elements in the equation too, including the importance of maintaining good Anglo-American relations. Therefore, when Churchill offered the Royal Navy's services, President Franklin Roosevelt told him that the Americans were happy to accept. Admiral Ernest King accepted, but he wasn't happy. Thus it was that in 1945, the British sent a task force to join the U.S. Navy in the campaign against Okinawa. On paper, at least, it was an impressive force. The British Pacific Fleet included 2 battleships, one of which was the King George V, which had hunted down the Bismarck back in 1941, and 4 aircraft carriers with suitably impressive names: Victorious, Indefatigable, Formidable, and Illustrious. Officially, British Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser commanded this fleet from his headquarters in Sydney, Australia, though it was agreed that operational command belonged to the American Theater Chief Chester Nimitz and the American Fifth Fleet Commander Raymond Spruance. King's skepticism about the value of Royal Navy warships had not been based on any disparagement of their fighting prowess. Rather, he feared that the British ships, which had been designed for service in the North Sea, could not be integrated into the American logistical matrix. And in fact, keeping the British ships supplied and filled with oil turned out to be a serious problem. In recognition of that, Spruance assigned the British ships specific tasks of their own, suppressing Japanese airfields on the several islands south of Okinawa, so that Japanese planes staged from Formosa could not land there. In addition to that, the British launched airstrikes against targets on Formosa itself. Soon, however, the demands of constant service in an alien environment began to show. By June of 1945, with operations on Okinawa winding down, most of the British ships returned to Sydney in Australia to refit. All that time, the American 10th Army was closing in on the Japanese stronghold on Shuri Ridge. The defiant Japanese endured daily assaults by naval gunfire, airplanes, artillery, and mortar fire. The battleship USS Missouri shelled Shuri Castle continuously for 3 days. On May 11, 1945, the Americans launched a large-scale coordinated attack on the Shuri defenses. For 2 weeks, the fighting was constant and intense, and by the end of the month, Ushijima had lost 70% of his strength. His position had become untenable. He ordered a fighting retreat to new positions a dozen miles further south. Despite brave talk, it was clear now, even to Ushijima, that it was only a matter of time before his force was completely overwhelmed, if not annihilated. By June, the Japanese had only about 8 square miles of the island. A few Japanese commanders in isolated pockets cut off from the main body, and seeing the hopelessness of continued defiance, committed ritual suicide. Others continued to resist until they were killed. A few discarded their helmets and walked out into the open, inviting the Americans to shoot them down. In the hope of getting at least some of the Japanese survivors to surrender, the American commander, Simon Bolivar Butner, authorized a propaganda campaign, ordering American planes to drop leaflets on Japanese positions, promising them good treatment if they surrendered. On June 18th, General Butner went up to the front line to observe the fighting around the last pocket of Japanese resistance. Butner crept up to an observation post and peered out between 2 boulders at the combat action below. At that moment, a Japanese artillery shell hit one of the boulders, sending fragments of coral rock flying in all directions. Fragments hit Butner squarely in the chest. If he did not die instantly, he expired within minutes. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action during the war. 4 days later, Japanese Lieutenant General Ushijima donned his best uniform, wrote a letter of apology to the emperor, and committed harikiri, disemboweling himself. Alongside him, dressed in a formal white kimono, was his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Cho, who also cut himself open. To complete the ritual suicide, designated subordinates standing behind them beheaded them with samurai swords. Resistance on Okinawa officially ended that same day, June 22nd, though mopping up operations continued until the end of the month. More than 12,500 Americans died in the fighting ashore and afloat. Japanese casualties were 10 times higher. Estimates ranged from 90,000 to 130,000 killed, the latter including those who could be presumed dead after being sealed up in caves by American explosives. Civilian casualty figures are less certain, with estimates ranging from a low of 50,000 up to 150,000. For Japan, any prospect of victory was now utterly shattered, and some Japanese now seemed unwilling to fight to the death. About 4,000 Japanese soldiers gave themselves up, and another 4,000 who had escaped into the hills surrendered later. As for American concern about Army-Marine Corps cooperation, that turned out not to be a problem. Marine artillery and air power supported Army units, Army tanks and planes supported the Marines. Apparently, they could work together, fight together, die together, and triumph together after all.